Hello, fellow splitting geniuses. Welcome to another live episode of Splitting Smart, where Heather and I get to have candid and super informative discussions with divorce and well-being professionals. Our goal, like always, is to provide you with the knowledge of various modalities of support that can help you to unhitch with fewer hitches. So today's conversation is for those of us who have children, and especially for those who are nearing the age of university, who are overwhelmed with the thought of not only the application process, but also what it means for your divorce settlement and how you could be one step ahead of the game by understanding what you will need to prepare yourself and your children in order to apply, get funding, and get into university. So I highly suggest that all of you take a pen and paper out because it's literally applying for university 101 or college. And it's pretty much an invaluable information, very much needed. So I'm Lila Aiken Ali, a mom, a divorcee, and a divorce coach, and the founder of Split FYI.
Excuse me. I'm Heather Steer, a divorcee, a CDFA, a mother of two girls. So this is near and dear to my heart, given that my kids are 12 and 14, and the co-founder of Split FYI. So we are live today. If you have any questions, I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll try to get to them. There's so much to cover with Tanya today. And I'm so excited, Tanya, that you are here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
So Tanya, a little bit of background, and I'm going to let you take away, introduce yourself actually to the audience and what made you get involved with college planning and divorce planning, two of big stressors in people's lives. Indeed.
Right.
Yes. So could you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your background and why you got involved?
Well, as I said, thank you, ladies, for having me on today. My name is Tanya Aure. I am a college planning specialist and a CDFA and also a divorcee. So my story isn't necessarily typical, but maybe it is. So I went through a divorce maybe 7 years, I believe, by this September, by this June, really, when things started to fall apart, right? Everybody going through divorce. Most people are surprised, or sometimes they think it's happening, but no matter what, it's such a game changer in your life. You're not expecting it, right? I was not expecting it. I was at home with my boys. They were all 4 and 2 at the time. When all of a sudden, apparently I'm getting a divorce. I was like, oh my goodness, right? So my prior career was as a legal editor back in DC. And so I had done some freelancing after we had moved here. I was pregnant with my second son. I had kept in touch, but at this point, I hadn't been working, right, for a couple of years at this point. But all of a sudden, I need to get back into work. Like, how is this going to happen? And so luckily, I was able to go back to freelancing, but ultimately figured out I needed to build something here in San Diego, right? And so one of the biggest pieces of our divorce was the 529s. Most people know what a 529 is, right? But it's a college savings account. I was one of those crazy people that saved while my kids were in the womb. Like, I just changed their beneficiary after they were actually born, right? Something you can do with a 529, just so you know. And I didn't understand how it was going to play out in our divorce, whether it was my asset, whether it was my ex-husband's asset, or was it really for my kids? So I got into the financial industry, specifically doing college planning, both admissions and financial, right? On the admissions side of it, I work with my students depending on when they come to me, whether it's holding their hand through the application process, whether it's helping them with their essays. And really the first big piece of it is understanding what schools would fit them. So I find on the college side of my world is you can't do one without the other. In other words, you can find a great fit academically for your kids, but you have to also consider the financial, because that's really where this is going to come down to. Your kid may be able to get into a great school, but you may not qualify for financial aid. So then a lot of it's coming out of your pocket. So on the college side of my practice, I wanted to help as many families figure out how they could either get more financial aid or plan for their future in terms of paying for college, right? I'm a big believer in education. I was in school forever. I went to college, I went to law school, and then I got all these lovely credentials along the way. So I'm a big believer in finding new things and learning new things, right? So as my college practice grew, and I started my own company and I had my own clients, ultimately what ended up happening is I had divorce clients start to come in the door too. And then I was presented with this opportunity to join Vesta, this other divorce organization, as a college planner. And so I joined them and got my CDFA. And really, college is only one tiny piece of divorce, but an impactful piece of divorce, right? Like it's one of those pieces that if you forget to discuss when you're going through a divorce, it could come back years later whenever your kid is ready to go to school and bite you in the butt, right? So to me, it's kind of a natural pairing. And so that's kind of what I do. I do both. So some people come to me strictly for divorce, their kids aren't ready. And if they don't even have any kids, I still do their asset and debt split and their cash flow and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things I found as I got more and more single parents is there are very different rules for single parents trying to obtain financial aid than there are for married parents, right? And these kind of nuances, most people don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, typically parents don't really get into this process until they have to.
Right.
Nobody wants to. It's stressful. And then if you add a divorce to that, you're not doing it. Like, this is not where you're spending your time, right?
Or even years after your divorce, you're like, suddenly you have to come back together with your ex to have these conversations and to work through this process, sometimes collaboratively. So,
right. And how many times have I seen parents who haven't spoken to each other in years, whether they just receive spousal support or child support, it's a direct deposit, but there's not a lot of communication, or there's a drop off or a pickup, or, you know, but college is one of those, both parents somehow need to be involved. And at the end of the day, if both parents are involved, you could really kind of harm your kids' chances of getting financial aid. So this is kind of why it's nice to have something already talked about, ready to fall back on. So that's kind of what I do. I do these two things.
Can you walk us, because you're saying that it's so interesting. I think that there's so many misconceptions out there anyway of how, okay, so, you know, whose name do we put it on? And is it the, you know, the parent, does it fall under somebody who's applying, who has them as under their taxes and so forth? So like, there's all these questions in the air. Can you maybe on the, you know, 101 version of it, like, what does that process look like when you're starting to think, even if you have children like Heather and I, okay, they're 12 and 14, so they're not exactly around the corner yet, but it's getting there, right? Okay, so what is that thought process? Like, who should start applying? Is it both parents that should be on that application? Right. Okay, great.
So let me kind of back it up. There are two types of college planning in general, not just divorce, but in general, I want to start with some basics when it comes to college planning, right? So there are two types. There's college funding, which is where our kids lie. My kids are 12 and 10. There's the college funding part where you're saving, you're investing, you're hoping you have enough by the time your kid goes to school. You know, you've got investment accounts, you've got 529s, however you're socking money away. So that's college funding. College planning at the high school level or later on is really about, one, how to spend that money in the most tax efficient way for college. Or if you didn't do the college funding or you weren't capable, it just wasn't in your budget at the time, now how do we pay for it? How do we pay for it with no savings? How do we pay for it in financial aid? How do we figure that piece of it out? So those are kind of the two pieces of college planning. Now for our kids, at this point, it's truly looking ahead, projecting costs out, and most parents don't want to know, frankly, how much it's going to cost by the time our kids go, because it's just this, you know, astronomical number that's a little soul crushing, frankly. Right, when you calculate it all out. But I just feel like it's better to have an idea versus stick your head in the sand on that one. right? So on the college funding side with our kids, the same kind of age, it's saving, it's investing, what's best. Are we using a 529? Are we using other savings vehicles? What's going to count? And that's really what people don't understand. That there are certain accounts that are going to count against you when you start applying for college through the FAFSA, which is, I'll get there, I swear.
Okay.
CSS profile,
Please
I'll get
do.
there, I swear. I will define those two things in a second here. But people don't realize that the way they have saved can, yes, help, of course, because you have the cash, but can also ding you a little bit when it comes time to financial aid. So for families that have our kids this age, that's what I like to clarify for them now. What does this look like? And let me tell you what's not going to count, what is going to count, and what that's going to look like. And since the three of us are also divorced, on the divorce side of that equation, we need to also look at our ex's income. We need to look at if we remarried, I remarried, look at that, what those numbers kind of look like. I think it's better, as I said, to understand those moving pieces, even when our kids are young, so we're not surprised at 14, 15, 16. Now, moving on to when the kids are 14, 15, 16, what does this mean? So this means we're moving toward financial aid. We're moving toward picking colleges. What's going to count for them? Okay. So on the financial aid side, one of the things that everybody should file is called the FAFSA. It's the free application for federal student aid. That's what you'll hear everywhere. All right. And that's the first piece of paper that almost every college wants. They pretty much require. So they can get a snapshot of your financial picture. And through filling out this application, something is spit out called the expected family contribution. So based on certain factors that you answer on the FAFSA, it spits out a number. Now, it doesn't take into account expenses. It doesn't take into account all these other things that you may have to spend money on. At the end of the day, it only takes into account income, household size. It takes into a bunch of factors, but a lot of the time you look amazing on paper, right? Like everything's fine on paper, right? In many places, that's kind of the deal. You look great on paper. However, it's not counting your $500 grocery bill a month, which turns into $6,000 a year, right? It's not counting all of these basic household expenses. So that particular
also, it's not even indexed for where you live. Like we live in an expensive part of the country,
right?
So they don't even do a cost of living index, right?
Nope.
Does it take into effect that when it's a divorced party, both parties, right?
Right. So here,
and even if one isn't willing to pay for the college, it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't really matter. So here's how the FAFSA works currently for divorced families, divorced parents. Currently, the way the FAFSA works is whoever has more custody of the child is who fills out the FAFSA. Okay, so technically speaking, right? So most people split their children 50-50. Sounds like Solomon's baby, but you know what I mean? Like most people split custody 50-50. And then when that happens, you can really kind of just look at which parent makes more or less and pick one. And that's completely okay, right? And then you only need one parent on the FAFSA. You don't need both. So when you're married, you have to put, so my husband and I will both have to put our incomes on the FAFSA. Whereas if I didn't remarry, it would just be mine. And, typically one parent makes less than two parents, right? So when one parent is only on the FAFSA, your expected family contribution is typically lower than if you've got two parents working, right? And so let me define the expected family contribution. This is what the Department of Education thinks you can afford to pay based on this piece of paper. Again, it doesn't take into account your expenses. Now it excludes certain things. It excludes the equity in your house. It doesn't take into account your retirement accounts, your annuities, any insurance. Like there are some assets that do not get counted toward that expected family contribution. Because at the end of the day, maybe somebody's retirement is a lot bigger than their current income. There are lots of reasons why, but there's something called the asset protection, where a portion of your assets is always protected based on the oldest age of the parent. Okay, but one of the new rules that's coming down the pike when it comes to the FAFSA is the FAFSA is going to require the parent who has a higher AGI, higher adjusted gross income, to be the one to file the FAFSA regardless of custody.
Wow.
It's going to really mess up a lot of the divorce community, because more often than not, more often, at least what I've seen, even in my own case, my boys live with me 100% of the time. We receive child support. But if you just flat out took how much my ex-husband makes in 2020 and how much I made in 2020, but if it wasn't a great year for anybody,
Right.
he wins, right?
Right.
Wins. So that's going to be a really difficult rule for a lot of single parents. There is a lot of pushback on that one because, I mean, it's not particularly fair, right? But I mean, there are so many instances, so many cases that it's not the parent that has the most money that actually has the child, that takes care of the child the entire time, right?
Exactly.
So I'm hoping that rule, frankly, goes away, or at least receives enough pushback that it'll be amended, because it's blanket. It's going to prohibit a lot of single parents from really helping their kid go to college. And that's kind of not in the spirit of the new legislation.
Yeah, that's really
the other piece of the new rules that I think is going to really affect divorced parents, or really all parents, is, so currently under the rules, if you have 2 children in college at the same time, your expected family contribution can be split in half. So for example, again, my boys, they're 2 years apart. If my expected family contribution when my first kid goes into school is $20,000, and mind you, this expected family contribution, it's not necessarily what you're going to pay out of pocket. It's just the number they use to calculate how much financial aid you are eligible for, right? They have to start somewhere, right? So this is their crazy formula that they start with. So $20,000 when my first child goes into college, expected family contribution. Okay. Under the current rules, when my second son goes in 2 years later, or 1 year later, or if they were twins, that expected family contribution is split in half. So now my older son, my expected family contribution is $10,000, which makes him eligible for more financial aid, right? Because you're helping parents out. So then my youngest son going in, also expected family contribution of $10,000, eligible for more financial aid. Okay, great. And the concept of that is, how many kids can you actually pay for in college at the same time? Like help families out, right? Like, and then obviously for divorced parents or single parents, that's going to be, so that really helps, right? I have a client right now, she's got 2 in college and the third one is debating on where she's going to go right now. The 2 get a lot of financial aid because there's 2, but they could be eligible for more once third goes in, right? Even a little bit. And every penny counts, right? Let's be honest. Every single dollar counts, whatever we can do. Great. The new rules are going to get rid of the discount for multiple children in college at the same time.
What? Who?
So under my example, my kid goes in, $20,000 expected family contribution, which they're now about to start calling the student aid index, because again, it's just what they use to calculate need.
Right.
New legislation says it's not fair that families with multiple kids get the discount. So the discount is no longer. So now my youngest kid will also get the 20,000 expected family contribution. So there's no more. So the calculation for each kid is the same as it was for the first kid when I only had one going. That's a problem.
That is a problem. When does this go into take effect?
So this is supposed to take effect 2023 to 2024 would be the first year. But what parents need to realize is that means it's on the 2022 FAFSA, right? So next fall, when people start doing the FAFSA, they're doing it for their kids that start fall of 2023.
Right.
So this is one of the other things I think can be confusing if you don't do it all day, is really understanding when and what counts, right? The rules change. And the other piece of the FAFSA that I think is confusing for a lot of parents, because it gets confusing for me still, I have to actually write out the years with my clients just to make sure,
Right.
is the FAFSA wants your taxes from 2 years prior to when your child starts school. So for example, the 2022, if I had a kid that was about to start college in 2022, as a freshman, they're going to want my 2020 taxes. But my 2020 taxes aren't filed until what? April 2021.
Exactly.
Right? So like understanding kind of the years and how they function, people don't realize. So what that really means in layman's terms is it's the year your kid is a sophomore, spring sophomore year. That's the year. So whatever January is in your kid's sophomore year, that's the tax year you need to pay attention to. And when I say pay attention, that means just have it in the back of your head. This is the year that I'm going to have to put on this piece of paper. And nobody's thinking about this, just so you know. Nobody thinks about this. Like people file their taxes. It is what it is. They sell a house, they sell a house. They move an account, they move an account.
Right.
They take a distribution from their 401 because they need it that year. Nobody's thinking about this.
No.
So wait, walk me through that. So like my daughter will be a sophomore in the fall.
Okay.
So is it my 2021 taxes or 2022 taxes? She's class of 2024.
It'll be your 2022 taxes. But the funky part is you don't file them until April of 2023 or 2022.
Or October.
Or October.
Extension.
Or
Yeah.
October. Right. So, you know, the process for financial aid is changing. And although there are some good things about the changes, so for example, the FAFSA is going to be significantly shorter. They think they make too much money. Why file this thing? I don't want to disclose my finances to all these random strangers out there in college. So one of the things the Department of Education has done is they've shortened the FAFSA. So the FAFSA used to be, you know, however many questions. It's kind of a choose your own adventure, honestly. You can get to certain questions on this form, and if you answer them a certain way, other questions don't show up, right? They've made it much more simple, the new version. They've also made Pell Grant eligibility more attainable. In other words, they raised the income level, but honestly, it was so low to start with that it's not necessarily going to do as much good as I think we need it to do, right?
Right.
So we'll see how that plays out. But that's the financial aid portion of it. For most schools.
Are there any alternatives?
Yeah, right. What are the alternatives? Well, you always want to file the FAFSA, because what a lot of people don't know is a lot of schools, in other words, You don't want to miss it. They'll make a lot of schools, before they'll even consider you for merit money, will still ask you to fill out the FAFSA. They just want the information, right? So I have more than a few high-end clients that are like, I'm not going to fill this out. I don't want to fill this out, whatever. And I'm very clear. I'm like, as long as you don't fill this out, the chances of her or him getting institutional money. So let me explain that real quick. So there's a bunch of buckets of money that can be used to pay for college. There's federal money. And of the federal money, there's scholarships, i.e. grants, right? And that's free money. We love free money. That's all we want in our life, right? Free money to go toward college. And then there's money you have to do something from, federal money. So for example, work study, where you work on campus, or it's a college endorsed job where your earnings go directly to school for college, room and board, tuition, whatever. But there's also loan money, right? Loan money is where everybody doesn't want to go for the most part, because they don't understand how it works. They don't understand what it looks like when their kid gets out of college. So that's federal money. There's also a bucket of institutional money, and that money is coming from the school itself. And the school evaluates whoever they've admitted on their grades, their transcript, their scores, or at least to be no test scores at this point, but their grades, their transcripts, their applications, and the FAFSA. They want to see, where are you? Because at the end of the day, even if you didn't qualify for federal money through the FAFSA, institutions have a lot more leeway. They can say, you know what, this is a really good student. We see a lot of potential. Here's some money, right? It's not as regulated as we've all seen through the past 2 years of how money works in colleges. It's not as regulated as the feds are. So those are kind of the big buckets of money. So that's why you always want to do the FAFSA. It's always required, you know, and I understand that there are many parents out there that are like, no, 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 no. And you know what, that's their choice. But by the same token, you're kind of leaving your kid out of a chance for free money. And I don't know, I mean, I know there are many, many people that maybe don't need the money, but at the end of the day, more people could use the money versus not use the money.
What would a scholarship then fall under? Would it be the same idea then? It's an institutional money, and they would still have to.
So there's scholarship money on both sides.
In order to get a scholarship, though, you still have to file for the FAFSA. Is that correct?
Yes. So here are a couple things. Yes. So you need to file the FAFSA to get scholarship money on the federal side. There are many schools that require something called the CSS profile. And I'm not even going to define CSS. I'll tell you right. I just call it the CSS profile.
Okay.
But what happens is many private schools ask for this CSS profile. It's called something like the College Student Scholarship Profile. And it's because the CSS profile dives significantly deeper into your financial picture.
Wow. So
where the FAFSA is like 100 questions, for example, the CSS profile is 200 questions, right? Something along those lines. And so where the FAFSA at least doesn't, for divorced parents specifically, FAFSA only needs one parent. Granted, if it changes to the higher income parent, whatever, but only needs one parent on the FAFSA if you are divorced. On the CSS profile, they're going to want both. They're going to want the person who has custody, and they're going to want the non-custodial parents' information as well. And it's almost to kind of counteract what the FAFSA has been doing by only taking one parent, and usually the lower income parent. Right. But the CSS profile is required by bigger private schools that have a lot more money to give. So the UC system, great system. Do they have a lot of money to give? Not so much, even though they have so many students in there, right? They've got endowments, they've got alumni. But if you look at any other private school where the tuition is $75,000 and they've got the same alumni and donations and whatnot. Private schools generally have more money to give, but they want to know what your real financial picture looks like.
Right.
So that particular, the CSS profile, that they get very far deep into your business. It's, but again, they have more money to give you, so it's almost worth it. It is worth it, actually, to just fill it out. Now, for divorced parents, one of the issues I've seen is, what if you're not speaking to your spouse anymore?
Yeah. And or they
What
refuse
if they
to pay.
didn't give you any child support this whole time?
Exactly.
What if they've disappeared into the ether? What are we doing?
Yeah.
So there's something called the non-custodial, the non-custodial parent waiver. And, that's a high burden to prove. In other words, no contact whatsoever in a very long time, maybe a death certificate. You know what I mean? That's something you need to work with the school in order not to file the non-custodial's information. Okay. But if you can't prove
question on this,
that,
can you file this so that you don't get the other party disclosed? So my information wouldn't be shared with my ex and his information wouldn't be shared with me. Can there be a Chinese wall, like a wall?
No. There is a Chinese wall.
So this is
there's absolutely a Chinese wall.
Oh, there is a Chinese wall. Okay.
So you can file
There
it,
is.
not seeing your spouse's stuff, ex-spouse's stuff.
Absolutely.
Because that
Absolutely. So you submit your information. Yes, you submit your information directly to the school. The other parent also submits their information directly to the school. But the offer to your child is based on both parents' financial information.
Yeah. Okay.
What if the other parent is not reliable to fill out that information or to do that information? And you find this often, that one parent, whereas might be present in the child's life, has no interest, doesn't want to go through that rigor mortal. The child is being penalized for this.
Right.
There's no waiver.
The child is being penalized.
Mhm.
Yeah. So one of the things I try to impress when I run into this problem on at least the custodial parent, and I've even talked to the non-custodial parent, I just try to make sure they understand their child will not get any financial aid at all if the non-custodial doesn't participate even in the basics, right? Unless you can get that non-custodial waiver done. I've literally tracked parents down to Australia. I've talked to the other side and said, hey, listen, I know that this is this, and this, but this is for the benefit of your child. How about you just fill out the paperwork and be done with it?
Yeah. This is why it's so important to have someone like you, like an independent person that's mediating kind of basically through this process. For people that are divorced.
Yes, because at the end, people don't know that, right? And then at the end of the day, if you really run into somebody, you can work with the school. You can write a letter saying, these are the circumstances. But generally, one parent not wanting to do it does not qualify for a non-custodial waiver.
Exactly, which that often is.
And now that I'm talking about this, but it's often the case. So one of the things I think is important for divorced parents when they're speaking or when there's a good time is to maybe plant that seed that this is something we will have to work together for even a short period of time down the path. Like after all the suffering and the pain and everything's, if that's where it is, in other words, if you're completely done with your divorce. But it's definitely something to mention, or at least to start that conversation earlier rather than later.
That actually brings me to something that I know we wanted to hit and touch point on, the MSA. And I know that you mentioned this, and we've spoken about this. So when people are negotiating, and they are talking, even if you have younger children. Can you please shed some light onto that? And what are the things they can do to prepare so that it might mitigate that eventual issue when it does come to everything that we've been talking about, the FAFSA, the financial aid, the grants, and so forth?
So obviously, so the court, as we all know, doesn't have any jurisdiction over the kid once they're 18, right? So court can't force one parent to pay or pay a portion of it. So while you're going through the divorce, one, of course, have that conversation, and maybe you can put in your MSA language that says each parent will be responsible, but again, not enforceable when the kid's 18, but put the language in there just so you and your ex have something to fall back on.
Right.
The other way I've seen it done that I think is really actually one of the better ways to do it is put it in a 529. In other words, make contributions to the 529 while child is under 18 mandatory, or say, you know what, you put $200 into this one 529 for this kid. I will also put $200. Now, usually, and I'm sure Heather can attest to this, you want to have all the accounts split. You don't want to be still sharing anything after the divorce. But in this particular case, you don't necessarily need both parents on the 529, but maybe some language that says you need to provide me an annual statement with your contributions to the 529. And if there's joint access, the other parent can also put the money in there, so everybody's on the same page.
Right.
Ideally, the 529, as Heather can attest to, is it's for your kid.
Yeah.
If people are willing to at least do that much, you'd hope that, frankly, their conscience is enough to keep them contributing to it.
And to not withdraw money.
At the end of the day,
exactly.
And there's the other piece of it, right? Do not withdraw. And I'm hoping, what I generally make sure people are aware of is you take that money out for unqualified expenses, you're getting taxed on it. It just is, right? So good or bad though, the 529 has expanded its definition of qualified expenses, right? So the way the 529 used to work is you could only take it out for basically college qualified expenses, tuition, room and board, like certain things, very certain things. Now they've expanded the 529 to say you can also take money out of the 529 penalty free for private schools, K through 12.
Really?
So if you have a 529 right now, your kid's 14, you want to send them to Parker or Bishop or something, you can take that money from the 529 out now, penalty free, tax free, and pay for that money. That's now a qualified expense. Okay. Now, the other piece of it is you can now use the 529 to pay for student loans up to $10,000 for the lifetime of the 529. That didn't used to be an option.
Loans or the beneficiary of the 529?
So the beneficiary of the 529. So your daughter goes to school, she's got $25,000 of debt when she gets out of school. That 529 can be now used for $10,000 of her loans for the lifetime. So she didn't use it all. So one of the problems with the 529 is if you don't use it all, what do you do with it? Like, I mean, granted, that doesn't happen very often, but what do you do with it? You can transfer it to another child, but now you have other ways to spend the money without getting dinged.
Right. Does it go towards
So
also expenses?
there are many nuances. Say that again.
Does it go towards also the expenses of college, not just the cost of college, but expenses of even living there, their living, all of that, right?
Yeah.
I'm assuming.
Room and board.
Yeah, there are certain, room, board, tuition, but there are certain things that it doesn't go to, right? It doesn't go toward necessarily if you live off campus, right? Once you live off campus, we're getting a little sketchy in terms of what's room and board, right?
Right.
Is that part of what the school is providing? Now that you're off campus, how does that work? But again, a lot of the time, this gray area of college and money, it's a case by case basis. You need to look at it. You need to look at every college's rules about what you can use, how you can use it. So it gets a little dicey, not gonna lie.
Yeah. I mean, it's a whirlwind of things that you have to think about. I know there was one of the things that you mentioned when we were talking, some of the notes that we had. There was a difference between what parent assets versus child assets. And how does that process work for divorce?
Yes. It's a big deal. So when assets are evaluated, when parent assets are evaluated for financial aid,
yes,
after what's called that asset protection allowance, the percentage that parent assets are evaluated at is 5.64%. So 5.64% of your assets are going to be counted toward the calculation for the expected family contribution. And that's after the asset protection. So in simple terms, if you have $100,000 worth of assets, the asset protection rule covers 20,000 of it. That means 80,000 of it is going to be subject to 5.64%. That 5.64% is what will be used to calculate your expected family contribution. Now, if a child, I don't know many children have $100,000 in assets, but for example, the child percentage is 20%. So if a child has $1,000 savings account,
right, which
it's 20% of that $1,000 versus 5.64 if it was your account.
Interesting.
So there are certain, you want to pay attention to that. So a lot of some of these college savings accounts are counted as child assets versus parent assets.
Right.
Right. So certain custodial accounts count as child assets. So if you set it up as a child asset, thinking you were going to avoid some sort of kiddie tax or whatever it works, however you put that on income in there, they'll get it back on the college side.
Oh yeah, big time.
They'll figure out 20% of that. Now, if you know that far enough in advance, you can stop contributing to that custodial account and find other ways to save for college, whether it's investments, whether it's another 529,
right,
whether it's insurance, whether it's different types of retirement accounts. But that's where the strategy comes in, right? I've seen people even cash in their 529s early enough. They pay the penalty just so they can roll it into something that isn't going to be counted against them for financial aid, right? Because remember, the 529, although for the beneficiary of the child, it's still your asset. It's still Lila's asset. It's still Heather's asset.
Right, but
so
it's not the
gets
child's
counted
asset.
into your overall asset number.
But it's not the child's asset.
But it's not the child's. That's why right.
So okay.
Right. So, again, lots of nuances.
I mean, there is, I think.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, are there any questions out there? And honestly, I think that obviously this is why, I mean, even though I've even taken notes, by the way, and I'll watch this over and over again and talk to you, but I think it's something that, and I know a lot of us don't think about being ahead of the game. And we grew up in a very different generation. I mean, it was a lot easier. And even then it was pretty hard, but it was a lot easier than it is now. So, I take it for granted. And I'm like, oh, so easy. You apply, you get into college. If you can't afford the college that's expensive, you go to somewhere local for a bit. I These are the things that, we thought about back then. It wasn't as complicated. So, but I think that this is a really important discussion to get your head around, and that people know there's people like you who can help them through this process and help the child ultimately. It's not just the parents, because it is super stressful to parents, but also the children. I think we overlook the stress levels that they're going through, to not only the exams, the SATs, and they have to get into college, they have to apply, and what college do they like, and can they get in? And they're also aware that it's expensive. It's, I remember I applied to 2 schools. I got into Georgetown, NYU, and a local George Mason. Okay. George Mason in-state, 3,000. And then I got a scholarship for lacrosse. It was nothing. I mean, literally. And then NYU, 32. That was 32 back in the day. Right. And I was like, I couldn't justify then the expense of living in New York. I mean, there's then and then and then and then, right? So it was a no-brainer, only because financially, forget about it. Although my dream was to go to NYU, which is so interesting, is that, you do give up, but like you said earlier, what you nailed it. You're like, and sometimes you've got to be really realistic, even though they get into good schools. If you can't afford to go, what's the point if everyone is stressed out? And it puts on a lot of stress. So it's also understanding for the child to understand, okay, what is realistic? What can happen? What can we get you in? What school we can get you into and we can afford. So
yeah,
which is super important.
No, it's very important. And Tanya, you work with people across the country on both elements of the financial planning part and the college entrance process as well, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're going to make sure your contact details are in. I'll put them in the comments in both places, because I mean, you're hired for me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so complicated. And compounding it with divorce and an ex-spouse and other people involved, it's even more. So I don't think we have
That's what I was going to say with divorce.
Go ahead.
I was going to say with divorce, it's really a different ball game, right? For married parents, it is what it is. There is, you're just filling out based off of your taxes. There are strategies to get your child financial aid. There are different ways to plan, different ways to spend. But for divorced parents or single parents, it becomes even more imperative to do the planning, right? Because your single income, all of these things come into account, your child support, your spousal support, all of them. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been amazing. There's so much good content here. And
great content.
Yeah.
We're going to put your details, but what is the best way for people to get in touch with you? Just so that we can say it in our interview.
The best way to get in touch with me is by email. And I believe strategic divorce planning, the one that you have, is perfectly fine. Right. I have another one that is Tanya at aureccp.com. Or frankly, send me a text. Like everybody else in the world, text is always the fastest way. Right. And that's 858-206-9411.
Perfect. We're going to put in our show notes. I'm sure you're going to be getting calls. You already know Heather's going to be calling you very shortly.
Absolutely. I'm already in the queue. Awesome. Well,
it really is. And thank you so much, because it does make you feel better. Like in the sense that, yes, it is, there's so much and it's always changing, but just to know that there's people out there who are on top of all of that, and that we don't have to necessarily be on top of every single change and understand all of that is refreshing to know. And thank you so much for sharing all this information with us. I took a lot of notes.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, guys. I appreciate it. I think there's probably a little bit of a delay. Hopefully it's not too bad, but thank you guys so much for having me. I love talking about college. It's happy. Ultimately, it's happy. It's stressful, but the end is happy.
Exactly. I mean, education is great. And, let's get these kids into the schools they want to go to.
Yes. Awesome. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, guys.